Hey, RetconRaider here. Today we're continuing our analysis of design document number 7, which covers the oddly tech-savvy cipher tribe of Mesa Verde. Last time we went over the area's general layout, as well as the characters and creatures that the player would have been able to meet in and around Mesa Verde. But today we'll be taking a closer look at the actual gameplay content planned for this location. First, it's important to understand that Mesa Verde was one of the few locations in the game that the player would absolutely have to visit if they wanted to finish the main storyline. Towards the conclusion of the main story, the player would need to acquire the schematics for a special computer chip that they would end up needing at the Bloomfield Space Center. Like many of the main story quests, the details here are pretty scarce, but what we do know is that the player would have needed to visit Mesa Verde during Act 2. They would then encounter Sim, one of the Cipher Nomads, who could point them towards the schematic they needed, presumably in exchange for helping the tribe with some of their many problems. The most obvious of these problems was the fact that the village was under siege by Drake and his band of Viper warriors, at the behest of Hecat's cult. While the Cipher tribe had the training and fortified position to theoretically fend off the Vipers indefinitely, they had effectively been cut off from the outside world and were slowly running out of food. Under more ideal circumstances, the Ciphers would have had sufficient food to last for quite some time, but unfortunately, current circumstances had resulted in a catastrophic food shortage at the worst possible time. The Cipher village relied on two main sources of food: a number of makeshift greenhouses atop the mesa, and a pack of domesticated mole rats in the caves. By the time the player first arrived in Mesa Verde, both of these sources of food would have been thoroughly compromised. Normally, the tribe's greenhouses wouldn't be able to grow enough produce to feed the whole village, but recently the crops had become unusually large. Unfortunately, the oversized crops were accompanied by some new complications. First, some of the villagers were beginning to fall ill. If the player had medical training, they could easily diagnose and treat the early signs of radiation poisoning. They could also gain some extra rewards by using their medical skills to improve the tribe's medical training. The second complication was much stranger. The hydroponic bays weren't just growing oversized produce, they were also growing weedlings, ambulatory mutant plants that were starting to attack the farmers. The first time the player visited the top of the mesa, they'd actually walk right into the middle of a fight. This would trigger an immediate minor quest, giving the player the opportunity to get some more quick rewards by stepping in and helping the farmers. Regardless of whether the player helped or not, the weedlings would be defeated, and ASCII would ask the player to find out what's going on. ASCII knew that Denom, one of the tribe's engineers, had done something to improve the hydroponic bays, but not much else. This was a fairly simple quest, and the player would have multiple ways to pursue it, but in the end the player would discover that Denom had started using a special miracle fertilizer that he had purchased from a wandering trader. It would turn out that this so-called miracle fertilizer was actually radioactive, and it was causing the plants in the hydroponic bays to mutate. Regardless of how the player found out about the tainted crops, the tribe would refuse to eat any more of them once the truth was revealed. This would greatly compound the tribe's current supply shortages, and the player would then be tasked with finding a way to help resolve the new problem. Denom would be mortified, and would give the player a minor quest to find a way to make the hydroponic bays usable again. The player could do this by visiting the followers of the Apocalypse at Hoover Dam to acquire some of their miracle wheat, a special form of wheat that could clean radiation from tainted soil. This would help in the long run, but it wouldn't solve the tribe's more immediate problems. ASCII would propose a more practical short-term solution, asking the player to work out a deal with one of the other Colorado settlements to smuggle more food into the village. The player could do this by working out a deal with the caravan companies at Hoover Dam, and then clearing out the mole rat caves so the caravans could smuggle the shipments past the Viper camp. It was also possible to work out a deal with the Brotherhood of Steel, but we'll talk about that a bit later in the video. A more permanent solution, though a very expensive one, involved finding a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit. The player could acquire one of these in the nursery, and then would be faced with the daunting task of deciding who to give it to. Mesa Verde actually had 2 people who were interested in getting their hands on that kind of technology. The player could obviously give the GECK to ASCII, which would quickly make the village entirely self-sustainable and allow them to outlast the Viper siege. The other person interested in the GECK was Isaac, the former Elder Scribe of the Brotherhood of Steel, who wanted to study it. If the player gave the GECK to ASCII, they would be rewarded with a massive reputation boost. But if they gave it to Isaac, then he would reward them with his old suit of power armor. The player could theoretically get a holodisk containing information about the GECK from Diana, the AI at the nursery, and then convince Isaac to accept that instead. But otherwise, they would ultimately have to choose between resolving the quest in an altruistic or selfish way. The player could also try to replenish the tribe's mole rat packs, but this would be a bit more difficult. Since the mole rat caves were down in the valley, the Vipers had easy access to them, and they had deliberately released mutant rattlesnakes into the caves to kill off all of the mole rats. The player could use the outdoorsman or science skill to help trap live mole rats at other locations, and then release them into the mole rat caves, but this would be pointless unless they first cleared out the mutant cobras. It would also be difficult for the Cypher tribe to really take advantage of the mole rat caves anyway, at least as long as the Vipers were still around. Speaking of which, there were numerous ways to help eliminate or drive off the Viper war party. The most straightforward solution, though certainly not the easiest one, was to simply attack them. This would lead to a difficult battle against 21 angry Viper warriors, but persuasive players could convince ASCII to send some Cypher warriors along to help. And science-minded characters could even provide these Cypher warriors with chems to help improve their performance in battle. More subtle players could instead use stealth to thin out the Vipers' numbers before attacking them. The Vipers would have alternating sleep schedules, but the player could quietly kill at least a few of them if they were careful. The player could also poison the Viper supplies, which would kill off enough of them to allow the Cyphers to easily wipe out or drive off the rest of the camp. Another potential solution involved using explosives to try to drop an overhanging cliff face onto the Viper camp. If the player had sufficient luck or explosive skills, then they would kill off all the Vipers in one fell swoop, but this would also prevent them from collecting any of the loot. The Cyphers also had a few ideas of their own, and the player could help with them. Trig, the tribe's most talented inventor, was working on 2 devices she hoped would help resolve the standoff. The first was an alarm to warn the village whenever someone was approaching along the main path, and the second was a massive laser cannon designed to wipe the Viper camp off the map. The player could help finish the alarm system with an easy mechanics or outdoorsman skill check, but the laser cannon would take a bit more work. Trig was trying to improvise the design of the laser cannon based on the designs of an old pre-war laser pistol, and she couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. The player could use the science and mechanics skills to help her pinpoint the problem, and then they'd have to find or build the parts needed to finish constructing the death cannon. Once the cannon was complete, Trig would use it on the Viper camp. The cannon would burn out after a single shot, but that would still be enough to destroy a big chunk of the camp and kill most of the warriors. Drake and a small number of warriors would survive, but they would be much easier to deal with. If the player happened to be playing a female character, then they actually had a potential means of resolving the standoff peacefully. They could use their deception skill to disguise themselves as a daughter of Hecate and convince Drake that Hecate had recalled the group back to the Ouroboros. The Vipers would leave, at least temporarily, which would give the Cyphers ample time to restock their supplies and better secure the valley. Of course, less altruistic players could instead choose to ignore the conflict, or they could even choose to actively help the Vipers against the Cyphers. The document doesn't really give many details about why or how the player might end up helping the Vipers, but it's possible that this was intended to be a quest the player could receive from Hecate or Drake. Regardless of how the players got the quest, the document mentions that the player could end up taking on various tasks related to undermining the Cypher's defenses. The player could sabotage the tribe's wind turbine, cutting off their source of water, or they could take a more direct route and poison the tribe's supplies. In either case, the ciphers would automatically suspect that the player was responsible, refusing to allow him back into the village, unless the player had a scapegoat. This is where a sick tribesman named Radian got involved. Radian was suffering from high desert fever, a disease that affected his nervous system and left him in constant pain. Altruistic players could earn some quick rewards by properly diagnosing and treating his condition, but more opportunistic players could instead get him addicted to painkillers and then force him to carry out the sabotage for them. In that case, the tribe would end up blaming Radian instead, leaving the player relatively unscathed. Once the player had sufficiently weakened the Cipher tribe, they would apparently be able to accompany the Vipers in their attack against the village. Again, details are scarce, but the document does mention the possibility of storming the gates alongside Viper warriors. Regardless of which side the player ended up taking in the conflict, their reward would be the same. They would receive a crude energy weapon, tailored to their combat skill of choice. If the player resolved the conflict in favor of the Cipher tribe, then it would open the door to a new potential crisis. With the siege ended, some wandering slavers would take advantage of the situation and capture several of the villagers who were enjoying the opportunity to finally go out and stretch their legs. ASCII would ask the player to rescue the missing tribals, and the player would be able to track the slavers back towards Denver using the outdoorsman skill. This would presumably allow them to ambush the slavers, and they would be rewarded based on how many of the tribals they rescued. There were also at least a few other things that the player could do around the village, once their most immediate problems had been resolved. For example, the tribe still possessed the old pre-war computer left behind by their ancestors. It held potentially irreplaceable knowledge of pre-war science and technology, but the computer had long since broken down. The tribe's chief, ASCII, wanted to repair the computer and give the tribe access to all of that ancient knowledge, but the tribe's shaman, the mnemonic, held more conservative views. He worried that all that technology would corrupt or endanger the tribe, and refused to cooperate with ASCII's request. Again, the details here are a bit vague and confused, but if the player decided to help ASCII, then they would need to find a replacement power supply for the computer. They would also need to find a memory core, presumably the one that was passed down from one memory keeper to the next, which meant that they would likely end up having to steal it from the mnemonic. Mesa Verde also had a small number of economic quests. I already mentioned how the player could set up food shipments between Mesa Verde and Hoover Dam, but the player could also establish trade routes with Denver. In that case, the salvagers in Denver would ship broken pre-war junk to the village, and the villagers would then repair it, selling it back to surrounding communities and giving the player the opportunity to purchase several high-tech devices. As I mentioned earlier, the player could also establish an alliance between the Ciphers and the remnants of the Brotherhood of Steel. This is an opportunity that ASCII would eagerly jump at, but the Brotherhood would be much more reluctant to tie themselves to a group of seemingly primitive tribals. If the player could prove how technically skilled the Ciphers were, then the Brotherhood would grudgingly accept the alliance, sending broken goods to the village for repair. The exact terms and consequences of this alliance would depend on which sub-faction ended up in control of the Brotherhood, but that's a subject for another video. Mesa Verde also had access to a few unique resources that the player could take advantage of. First, they still had the enriched uranium that their ancestors had originally salvaged from the ruins of Los Alamos. The Ciphers had no use for it, so if the player had a high enough reputation with the tribe, then they could work out a deal to purchase it from them. They could then turn around and sell it to the ghouls at the reservation or the Brotherhood of Steel, which would presumably net them a hefty profit. Similarly, some of the Ciphers made use of special ultrasonic devices that kept them safe from wild animals. The player could acquire one of these devices from the Ciphers and then hook it up to the klaxon system back in Denver to drive all the feral dogs out of the city. Mesa Verde also offered some other quests that tied it to different factions or locations. For example, the player could actually ask the Ciphers to help resolve the issues with the Boulder Dome AI. Likewise, Isaac was one of the Rogue Brotherhood scribes, but we'll talk about that when we get to the Maxon Bunker design document. But one thing we can talk about, at least briefly, is the standoff between Alexandra and Blackjack. Now, I've touched on both of these characters in the past, so I won't waste too much time rehashing what we already know. Blackjack was a super mutant infected with the new plague, and one of the escapees from the Tibbetts facility. Alexandra was a bounty hunter, currently pursuing the open bounty that Caesar's Legion had placed on Blackjack's head. Alexandra had managed to corner Blackjack at the end of a box canyon, but now the two were locked in a standoff. Blackjack had a fake gun and ample supplies, but Alexandra was simply too stubborn to give up on the bounty. Both Blackjack and Alexandra would ask for the player's help in resolving the stalemate. There were numerous ways the player could resolve this quest, but the results would generally be more or less the same. If the player decided to help Blackjack, then the super mutant would either offer payment in cash, or he would offer to accompany the player back to the Tibbetts facility, at least temporarily. But he would then get sidetracked gambling at Hoover Dam, and the player would end up having to force him to hold up his end of the bargain. If the player instead decided to help Alexandra, then they would get a share of the bounty, but they would effectively lose access to Blackjack, unless they could convince Alexandra to let him go, or they planned on freeing the slaves at the Legion camp in Denver. In either case, as long as the player played their cards right, they would be able to recruit Alexandra as a companion, provided they could convince her that it would be a profitable partnership. While we don't know the ultimate fate of Alexandra or Blackjack, we do know that there were at least 6 planned epilogues for the other inhabitants of Mesa Verde. Most of these epilogues involved the tribe being wiped out, possibly at the hands of the player, the Blades of the Viper War Party, or even as the result of one of Victor Presper's nukes. In this case, the tribe would die out and their ancestral knowledge would be lost forever. If the player had dealt with the Vipers, then the Ciphers would return to their old semi-nomadic way of life, with no significant changes to their routine. If the player had instead forged an alliance between the Ciphers and the Brotherhood of Steel, then the consequences would vary, depending on which subfaction controlled the Brotherhood at the end of the game. But officially? Well, that's a good question. The Cipher tribe is almost completely unmentioned in any of the officially released Fallout titles, with the sole exception of a single line of dialogue in Fallout New Vegas. In New Vegas, Elijah, former head of the Brotherhood, briefly mentions that he studied with the Ciphers. This actually runs parallel with how Isaac was intended to be a rogue Brotherhood scribe who also abandoned the Brotherhood and ended up studying with the Ciphers, perhaps implying that Isaac served as the inspiration for the eventual creation of Elijah. But as for the ultimate fate of the Cipher tribe, well, we'll probably never know. Next time, we'll be diving into design document number 8, which covers the nursery, one of the most pivotal locations in Van Buren. I've mentioned this location a number of times over the past few videos, and it's finally time to take a closer look at the mysterious pre-war facility. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out all 700 pages of the leaked design documents for yourself by visiting the fan-run wikis. Links are in the description.